Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the Industry Future Challenge 2023. My name is Ravi Dindyal, your host for today and CXO at Prepper. Some of you may have heard of Prepper and what we do, but our mission at Prepper is to educate, innovate, and collaborate. Our Prepper platform, prepperlabs.org, is a learning platform that has a wide array of digital capability labs and other types of learning tools. So please check that out. On the innovation side, part of our mission is to spark innovation, accelerate innovation. Then on the collaboration, it's bringing like-minded people together to work on small and dedicated teams to make changes and tackle challenges. So that's a bit about Prepper. As part of our mission to educate, innovate, and collaborate, our sponsors, the Natural Resource Council, Magnet, and Linux, has entrusted us to deliver this very important program. So what is the Industry Future Challenge? Well, it's broken up into 4 parts. And at Prepper, it was started in 2019, and it explores the intersection of technology and the impact on key industries. So we're starting with food, obviously, today. So the 4 steps and where we are is in step 1. So this is really about bringing together panelists like we have to have discussions around topics, various topics, explore these topics, just light on them, and then pick a challenge that we think would be interesting to tackle. Step 2 is launching the challenge, opening up the challenge or the problem statement, inviting teams to collaborate and develop a solution for the project that we've identified. Step 3 is working on the challenge. So this is about a 2-month period where various teams would be able to sort of pull together their project or business case. And then step 4 is judging and awarding a prize. So that's kind of a quick overview on the challenge. You can go on our landing page and there's more information there. So moving on to the future of food. Some quick data points on why we chose this topic. After the pandemic, food prices for items like bread in Canada has risen in the last couple of years. It would have made sense to have them fall or remain the same after the pandemic, but for some reason they rose. Sadly, there's a war in Ukraine, which has affected global food supplies. For items like cereals and vegetable oils, Odessa, an important port in the Ukraine that supplies many food staples, has been compromised by the war. Again, my reaction was that, well, Ukraine's far away. And in Canada, we have similar geography, soil makeup, and should be able to produce the same types of foods from the Ukraine. So what am I missing? It's not adding up for me. Also, another data point here is that in Canada, we've gone through a series of inflation, rising food prices. So while this has been occurring, Canadian grocery chains like Loblaws and Sobeys have published record profits. Again, something that doesn't add up. Lastly, I think we take for granted how food gets to our table. It's a miracle that we can plant seeds in the soil to produce corn or wheat and then do that at scale. This honestly is a scientific wonder. And if the system that feeds us falls apart because of wars, disease, or technology, agricultural technology, supply chain technology, is Canada prepared? So with that said, moving on to how we're going to solve this and kick this off, that is the context for our topic today on food. Today, we've curated a great mix of panelists with varying backgrounds in finance, law, food innovation, and of course, farming. So we're very excited to introduce Shiraz, Jenna, Dana, and Glenn. And we'll start with some introductions of this team. Just give me a sec here to end my slideshow. And why don't we kick off with you, Jenna? Good morning.
My name is Jenna Corey Hanna. I'm an associate lawyer at Kinch Eddy Litigation, which is a civil litigation firm located in Campbellford, Ontario. My practice primarily focuses on land use planning and municipal law, but due to the rural location of our law firm, a lot of my clients are farmers, or I'm routinely dealing with issues involving farms and farming properties. In addition to that, I am on the board of directors for the Canadian Association for Food Law and Policy. If you haven't heard of us, I highly recommend that you check us out. We have a conference happening in Thunder Bay in November, and it's a really excellent conference being held for the 7th year. Because of my practice area and where we're located in such a rural context, I guess I have some unique qualifications and some unique thoughts on how law itself is impacting the food industry and farmers in particular, and I'm looking forward to discussing that with everyone.
Awesome. Thanks. Why don't we move to Dana? Morning, Dana.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm really looking forward to learning from the perspectives of the others here today, because that's basically what I do all day long. I run the Canadian Food Innovation Network. We are a not-for-profit that's funded by the Strategic Innovation Fund, which is administered by Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada under Minister Champagne's mandate. And we exist to champion innovation in the food sector. So my members are a blend of the innovators, the builders, the people who are really savvy with technology, and then those companies who are interested in adopting technology to help to grow their food businesses. And those are generally SMEs, some MNEs, and they are across many different verticals within the food sector. So we would have food processors and manufacturers, people running food service businesses, people in grocery retail. So through our 3,300 plus members, I have access to a ton of information because those folks are coming to us applying for programs that we fund when those builders and innovators do projects together as, sort of test bedding, prototyping, that kind of thing. So I know what problems they're trying to solve to find more opportunity to grow their businesses. And then I also, under my mandate to build this community, have built a platform called Yodel, YODL, no E. And that is where there's a lot of activity. Our members are on there chatting each day. They are posting their needs. So if they're looking for a particular, product, or they want to figure out an innovation problem and they want to know who they would go to have great conversations or to access good information. It's a combination of a media site, because we publish a lot of new content there every day, and a business social site. So I have access to a tremendous amount of data, both anecdotal and quantitative and qualitative, which is 3 things, not 2. I just said both. And I hope to be able to funnel that insight into this discussion today. I also have been active in the food industry for more years than I care to tell you about. I've gotten a little bit further away from people's mouths with each job I've had. I started out as a chef. I worked in food media for a long time, both in print and on television. I was on a Food Network and global TV show for a number of years, and did a lot of morning TV, and then moved into working in corporations, food manufacturing corporations, that at a senior product development and marketing level, before moving to working in incubation and acceleration with food companies and agri-food companies. Part of that time spent at the University of Guelph supporting the researchers there as they wanted to commercialize their IP, helping them to understand how to demonstrate the flexibility and the value of what they created. So I've got both today's insights and the accumulation of my career's insights that hopefully will be valuable to this audience today. And if any of you think that what we're doing at CFIN sounds like it's interesting to you, membership and access to Yodel is free, and you're welcome to become a member at, you can just Google yodl.ca and it'll take you right to our website. So thanks for this opportunity, Ravi.
Thank you. Well, that's interesting. I didn't realize you were on Food Network and you're a chef, have that background. That's fantastic. Yeah, I will be sure to check out Yodel and we'll put it in our show notes. Thanks for that great introduction, Dana. Over to you, Shiraz.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. So I guess I'm not necessarily a specific food expert, but I am the token finance guy of the group here. So I work on Bay Street and I have been for the past 2 decades. I am a senior portfolio manager and financial advisor with Sartorial Wealth of Raymond James. So basically, I can comment on finance, economics, things of that nature. And I've done a lot of stuff with the media. I was on CBC a couple times recently talking about the grocery rebate, or if that's really more of a nomenclature thing. We can get into some of the political side of stuff if that's something that people want to talk about. But I'm more of the financial person. I can talk about, more the industry side and the economic side of how, more so the supply chain, but stock prices, things of that nature. That's sort of more of my wheelhouse. And anecdotally, I am a consumer of food, so it definitely affects me just like everybody else. And I am a bit of a critic, and I have my own opinions on how things are being done. But I'd love to hear more from the other experts as well, and here to learn just as much as I am to give some insight. So I appreciate you guys giving me some time to chat. If you more about my practice, Sartorial Wealth of Raymond James, and I also do run a YouTube channel as well. It's Sartorial Wealth of Raymond James on YouTube as well.
Thanks, Shiraz. Interesting story, but Shiraz, I was watching CBC one night, working on this, and there he was on TV, and I, with the team, reached out to him, and here he is. So that was a pretty cool little story. So again, thanks for being here, Shiraz. Really excited to get your perspective on the topic. Last but not least, Glenn, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks very much, Ravi, for having me. Really appreciate this opportunity. I may be a farmer, but I can put a few slides together. So I've got a couple of slides here. I really wanted to show people the farm. And so I'm just going to kick that off. So I am the farmer at Cold Springs Organics. We're a certified organic farm east of Toronto. And my background is not in farming. I grew up on a dairy farm, said I'll never, ever be a farmer in the future. And I did the smart thing, went off and studied engineering. I worked in the oil fields for a little while. And then I spent most of the rest of my career working in IT. I have 3 kids. And when the youngest here in the top corner was born, Grace, it really opened my eyes to what was happening with climate change. I spent a lot of time researching what I could do to leave the earth in a better state that when I entered it for my kids' sake.
Glenn,
Yes.
So sorry to interrupt you. I think you're sharing the wrong screen.
Oh, shoot. Can you see that?
We're seeing your AirMeet email, Gmail right now.
Okay, hold on for a second.
Got to go back to those tech skills, huh?
I guess. It was definitely on my desktop. I haven't used AirMeet before, so all right, sharing screen, entire screen. There we go. Sorry about that, Ravi.
Yeah, no problem.
Now I'm guessing you're seeing it.
Yes, there we go. Perfect.
Okay. All right, so here's my farm. And so basically when Grace was born, I decided I needed to start farming carbon. And, basically trying to pull greenhouse gases out of the air and back into the soil. So how do we sell from Cold Springs Organics? One is at the Coburg Farmers Market, and the other is through weekly veggie box subscriptions. So you might see places like Mama Earth Organics or what have you. They buy from farms all over the place. What we do is we package a bin of our farm's produce and we deliver it on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis for our customers. And my vision is, would the world be a better place if we had one small farm like ours for every 100 families, and we were producing food and getting it directly to the consumers? There's a lot of benefits of that. With regenerative agriculture, we can draw down greenhouse gases, we can regenerate the soil health, we can encourage biodiversity, and also we keep more money within the community. We bolster food security by getting the food closer to the customers. We also give our customers the best, most fresh produce that's available anywhere, and it's going to improve their health as well as reducing our carbon footprint. So That's basically what I wanted to share with you, and really interested to talk about the future. I have a lot of ideas and hopes for the future of food, and so I'll hand it back to you.
That's amazing, Glenn. Thank you so much. Beautiful family, beautiful farm. Hopefully one day I can make it up there and visit you with my kids, and I'll, learn about all the great things you're doing over there. So thanks everyone for those introductions. Before we jump in, just a note to our audience, please use the chat to ask any questions, and we'll attempt to answer depending on time at the end, before we wrap up. Okay, so let's start our discussion with looking globally and then zooming in more on Canada. As I mentioned in the intro, there's the war in Ukraine, as I've sort of read, has affected food prices globally. So just passing it over to the panel, you guys jump in as needed. What specific types of food have been affected by the war in Ukraine?
I'm happy to kick that off. The Ukraine, as you mentioned, does have a somewhat similar geographic and agricultural profile to Canada, but they also, have some really unique things going for them. Their climate is generally a little bit more temperate. The Ukraine, I think we all know, was a huge supplier of sunflower products to the rest of the world. It is, the color of their flag and their national symbol. So we have seen a huge problem within the food supply chain, particularly in food manufacturing and in food service, of a lack of sunflower oil products. And you might say, oh, yeah, sure, no problem, we'll just shift. But if you think about the timing of when the war in Ukraine started, it was in February. And guess what? Farmers, I'm sure Glenn can corroborate this, they've already ordered their seeds. They've already planned their crop rotations. They know what they're growing for that season when February hits. So the timing of the war certainly was an issue there, and impacted and continues to impact the ability to satisfy global, not just Canadian, needs for sunflower products. The other thing that is a huge problem right now for people who are in particularly bottling and canned type goods is that there's been a massive shift away from tin towards using aluminum. And aluminum's lightweight, and I think has some recycling advantages. I could be a little wrong on that. Ukraine is also one of the #1 suppliers of aluminum. So as we see a ton of Canadian companies and North American companies generally trying to move towards aluminum because of its sustainability and lightweighting to, make supply chain costs lower, et cetera, they've developed these great new products that they can't make because there's this lack of aluminum. So those are two that are top of mind and are in fairly frequent discussion in the circles that I travel
in. Thanks, Dana.
I can jump in a little bit there, Ravi, as well. So Dana hit the nail on the head for the kind of the major one. So there's obviously the oil export, and of course the grains, generally speaking. Now Canada is obviously quite abundant in grain as well. Another one that was more of a temporary phenomenon, but this is just what happens. So capital markets tend to react to global macro events. So a global macro event is anything like a war, an invasion, anything that's going on geopolitically around the world. The capital markets tend to react to it. So there was a temporary spike in both crude oil and natural gas during that time frame, at which point after that happened, they did come back to kind of more pre-war levels, and we've come back into a more normalized environment. But whenever things happen that would say outside of the norm or an outlier event, it does cause a spike, and the markets tend to react. People, you could say, are always a bit on edge when it comes to investing, period. And whenever anything happens, and institutions tend to really react quite quickly to it, and that can actually either make the problem worse or better depending on the circumstance. So that's just more of a byproduct of the capital markets.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Anyone else want to add anything on that before we move on? Okay.
Sorry, I just want to make one quick point. I think that if you look at between COVID and the war in Ukraine, Ukraine is like something like 2% of the world's wheat supply. So only a small fraction, but I think when you see the war and also the impact of fertilizer coming out of Russia, Belarus, the price of fertilizer has gone way up. I think it shows how fragile our global supply chain is for food. And, it's going to be impacted by high sensitivity to issues like that. But I also think profiteering has been a big factor in the rise in the price of food. Like basically the grocery store is taking advantage of, a global crisis like, Ukraine, and now Canadian food prices have gone way up as a result of it. Price of oil is up, but even for corn and soybeans, that's a really small fraction of the cost of, farming corn and soybeans. So, I think that's worth noting that Ukraine has been an issue, but it's really, I think it should be a much smaller factor than what it has been. And I think just a lot of profiteering is one of the issues.
So opportunists taking advantage of a situation. Something I want to come back to, on supply chains, because I've read, the port of Odessa, this important port in Ukraine, that initially when the invasion happened, Russia was not directly attacking it because it was an asset. And I think now that has changed and they have, compromised the port and destroyed the infrastructure. So going back to supply chains, Glenn, I think you mentioned 2%. So that's why for me, I'm just trying to understand the port in Odessa from a supply chain perspective for food. How important is that for Canada or North America?
I can't speak to the port of Odessa specifically, but ports and points of entry are extremely important. If you look at the province of British Columbia, they had, massive logistical issues during COVID where they were unable, for instance, to prioritize which containers would be emptied or shipped by truck first. And so you had, fresh foods languishing on the deck while they, moved new, goods that had no shelf life issues. Then, of course, they've also had strikes and all kinds of labor disruption, which has been an issue. BC in 2021 in the fall, they had that atmospheric river that washed out the highway. And if you were to look, as I have, at the mandate letter for the Minister of Agriculture in British Columbia, you will see that it is specific in Minister Alexis's mandate letter from the Premier that she and her team really focus on creating local sustainable supply chains. And they're doing that in a number of ways. One, they've created 14 what they call food hubs, which are basically food incubators. And they are trying to make sure that people are growing, like Glenn is, and then processing and creating high quality, macronutrient dense foods within geographies, so that if a highway gets washed out and is at a commission for 3 months, that people have access to all the food they need. It's a long journey though, and it's difficult because we like having an orange in January and we like having a constant supply of things. There's also an entrepreneurial education curve that I would say that province is dealing with right now, in that most people who go into the food processing business want to do something that they like to do. They're like, oh, I have a family jam recipe. I like to make hot sauce. They want to express themselves. So saying to those entrepreneurs, oh yeah, you know what? We got enough jam. Could you actually create something with protein that would sustain people for a number of months and become a pantry staple for them that they buy on a weekly basis? That's difficult too. So not to obfuscate around your question, it's just not something I could really answer, but that context of British Columbia, I hope, offers a little bit of insight on where you were trying to go.
Yeah, no, I think my last question on sort of the global area and the war is, something that was mentioned around fertilizer from Russia. again, in preparing for some of the things that I read was that, Russia does have a rich or a large supply of fertilizer to Europe. And because of this is being compromised. I don't know if you guys have anything to add to that. Maybe a more specific question, do Canadian farmers depend on Russian fertilizer?
Okay, well, I'll try and chime in, but I don't know with certainty. I mean, it's going to affect the global fertilizer market, but definitely crops like corn and soybeans are super dependent on fertilizer. And the thing is that I think too much of our food is dependent on synthetic fertilizers. Like we should be growing, none of the stuff that I grow uses synthetic fertilizers. And I think over time, we need to get a lot more precise with our use of fertilizers. And there's government initiatives to try to get really specific about putting down the right amount of fertilizer instead of just filling the spreader and putting it down, in mass quantities. And the price will probably help farmers get more precise about that too. But, for corn and soybeans, yes. But those, really is a small amount of that is used for your daily food, your quality food, I would say.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Glenn. Okay, so moving on, I guess, to supply chains and Dana, some of what you're talking about. What are the main Canadian crops that have been affected by recent events with supply chain disruption? Is it corn, wheat, cooking oils? Okay, I'll move on to the next question. And just again, I think you were talking about supply chains, local supply chains. Dana, do you mind expanding on that concept a bit more? Like, what does that mean exactly? Like,
yeah, I think the vision is that a geographic area of a town or a township, a county, or a number of counties in the context of British Columbia would be able to serve all of their caloric and nutrient needs with locally grown, locally produced and processed foods and sold foods. So it's interesting because when you think about, and maybe I'm a focus group of one, but when I think about how I shop these days, I live in Dufferin County, which is about an hour, 20 minutes north of Toronto. I live in a rural neighborhood, or a rural setting, even though I'm not a farmer, but I live next to farmers. And so I have all of these options for shopping. I go to my local grocery stores, my local, produce stands and farm markets, and I get, my food that way. But then when I want something, and I'm going to sound really precious here, but when I want the perfect cherry for my Manhattan, I go online and I order that. And if I can find it from somebody who's, a Canadian distributor who's got a cocktail kind of a business, I buy it. But if I can't find it there, then I go to Amazon. So I don't think that even someone like me who tries to be spending their dollars local, probably, I don't know, and I'd love to hear how Glenn's customers, and I know, Jenna, you live in Campbellford, I think you said, so a semi-rural kind of area. I'd love to hear whether or not you two see consumers like me, and what's the downside, I suppose, would be my question to the rest of the panelists, of us being 100% local. Is there one? I mean, I won't suffer if my Manhattan has, a frozen cherry that I bought at the farmer's market, but I really do like those ones from Spain. I'm not going to lie.
If I could just weigh in here, just from a municipal perspective, but one that predates COVID, we've been seeing municipalities really taking this idea of local food and local food sovereignty upon themselves as projects. And so, as an example, the city of Thunder Bay has a local food action plan and a committee, like a municipal committee, that oversees the implementation of that plan, which is really interesting. I don't think that when municipalities came about into existence that we foresaw municipalities taking these type of issues upon themselves to try to offer some sort of solution, but we are seeing that, and I think that this type of work has become increasingly important. And some of the issues we saw come around with supply chain issues during the pandemic, especially in the early days, I think highlights that. So if you're someone who's really interested in local food and you don't know where to start, a lot of municipalities have local food plans and have sections of their websites dedicated to help people access local food. And I find it really interesting. That's not something that you expect of municipalities. And the fact that they're putting in some, probably a nominal amount, but some amount of property taxes and putting them into developing food chargers and plans to help bolster the local economy. And I think we're just going to continue to see that trend. And then so I'm actually also a vendor at a farmer's market, and that's how Glenn and I know each other. My spouse owns a pizza company called Toller Pizza, and we do try to incorporate local ingredients and things. Like Glenn, for example, grew all the basil that we use in our sauce and on our pizzas. And I know, like, we do see a lot of people at the farmers market, but I always think we could do better. I think farmers markets and buying directly from farmers, unfortunately, has a bit of a reputation as being a much more expensive option than grocery stores. I don't think that's necessarily true, but how do you convince people to actually go out and scope the prices themselves and do something when there's that perception attached to it?
Yep.
I can jump in a little bit on the perception side a little bit. And as a front row seat, helping people manage their wealth. And, this is one of the things that I've been asked to speak a little bit on TV about. I think there's two misconceptions. So number one, that buying local and that buying, farm to table type products are more expensive. There is typically a little bit of a slight delta. How much of that is the farmer's fault versus the retailer, to be determined. So, and I think that if we were to actually be able to get a proper accounting on, let's say, a lot of these major grocery retailers' balance sheet, they don't necessarily say how much of that is coming from that component. So that's one variable that I think is definitely important for us to be able to determine. And then just generally speaking, Canadians right now are going through the worst bout of inflation that we've seen in the better part of 4 decades. And so the challenge is, I think that this is an important question to be asked, and we definitely need to solve it and make sure that we have food security, not to mention other types of security. Like after COVID and Ukraine war, the crisis came out, and we determined that number one, like for example, we don't make any of our own. A lot of pharmaceutical ingredients are not coming from Canada, for example. So there's a lot of essential things that we're not producing in our country anymore due to globalization. So we've seen a trend of a lot of countries moving back to more nationalistic type policies. So I think it's a healthy thing that we need to be doing. So that's point number one. And then point number two is once you start realizing, okay, we have to get our inflation problem under control first, I think before consumers would be in a position to be able to go through. And I'll give you an anecdotal example. Literally 2 days ago, I went to Loblaws to go pick up some just produce. And obviously not the greatest option of a lot of different ones, but point of the story, just anecdotally, went to go get zucchini. I got to get one zucchini for $2.99, but they had their imperfect pack that was $2.99 for 3 or 4. Right. And that's, I think, a profiteering thing. It has a bunch of different angles that are embedded into that. But the point is, most consumers right now feeling the pinch are going to go with the cheaper option right now, not because they want to, because they're being forced to. But if they had their choice, I think most Canadians would prefer to support local. I know myself, I do whenever possible, but it's not always feasible for everyone. So I think that's just sort of a point to consider.
Yeah, no, thanks, Shiraz. I mean, just jumping into that, you mentioned Loblaws and profits. So again, we all kind of, it's easy to kind of pick an enemy in this battle. And, reading that during COVID, post-pandemic war in Ukraine, they are at record profit levels. And it's not just Loblaws, not to pick on them, but I think big Canadian grocery chains in general. And I guess the question on the table then, do we have an oligopoly in Canada? And should it be changed? So let's start with, do we have an oligopoly?
Yes.
Absolutely, we do. We have 3 major grocery chains that own 80% of our food or food distribution in Canada. So you can choose which one you want, but they're all effectively the same.
Yeah. And again, maybe to you, Shiraz, to start this off on the profit side, And then Glenn mentioned sort of being opportunistic and, taking advantage of market factors, global economic factors. Are there profits? What should they do? Like, because they kind of have a social responsibility as a grocery chain to say, hey, we're making 30% year-over-year profits while the population is suffering from inflation, housing crisis, whatever it is. Do we think that that model should change and they should have like a limit to the profits they could make? I don't know what the panel's thoughts are on that topic.
So it's a good question. I think it's a little bit of a slippery slope question as well, just because we're generally speaking more of a capitalistic society, right? So to limit publicly traded companies' profit potential is a bit of an interesting one. I think that there is definitely some essential items for life that people should have access to. So I'm personally in favor of that, but generally speaking, to limit a company that is a for-profit company, their ability to generate profits is, I think, a difficult one for any politician. I don't think they'll have a lot of political will to be able to actually pull that off. But two things to note, and like, look, you said it yourself, Ravi, that they are the easy target, right? But just to put into perspective, yes, they post a $500 million quarterly profit. It sounds like an obscene amount of money. It's because it is. But generally speaking, that's 3%, I think, of their total, right? So their margins on food are only about 3%, which is not great. When you look at most other businesses, the margins, a healthy margin is 10, 15, 20%. But on food, they only have about 3% margins. So I think they're making money, not necessarily just from that. I think that's part of the reason why they have gotten so big, and little players have difficulty surviving in this environment. And they've been on, each one of those three, Sobeys, Metro, and Loblaw, the major corporations, have been on an acquisition sprees for the last 3 decades. And they're buying anybody and everybody who's in the grocery business. So even the one that looks like a mom and pop store is probably owned by one of them. So I think that's part of the reason why, is that they're able to create profits at a larger scale, even though the numbers sound really big. When expressed as percentage terms, they're actually not as big as most people think. So I know we like to demonize them. I think the things that we should be looking at is whether or not, the $4 million in share buybacks that they did with some of their that's, I think, a problem. But they're never going to control these things with the publicly traded company.
So I'd love to jump in on what Shiraz is saying. I agree with everything he's saying, but to give you sort of the other side of this view, whether or not their profits are outsized or not is one thing, but we do have a lack of competition. So my last corporate job was vice president of marketing and innovation for a Quebec-based food manufacturing company, and our client base was, depending on where the dollar was, 45 to 55%, sometimes in Canada versus the US. It sort of flipped around from year to year. One of the insights that I gained was that in Canada, and I would say that, we need to expand the conversation. The grocers are, of course, of interest, but two of the biggest vendors of food in Canada are Costco and Walmart, and they don't get into this conversation as often as I think they should. And I can tell you that it was much more difficult to launch a profitable product in Canada working with these 5 vendors that we considered our main Canadian customers, because they all want exclusivity. They all want to have their own flavor, their own pack size, what have you. That creates tremendous complexity and inefficiency in a food manufacturing setting. The most efficient way to manufacture anything is lots and lots of the same thing, the same size. That's how you get contribution margin. So, you had, a lot of inefficiency bred from this need for these people, these businesses to compete. But then you also had very limited options. So being able to find your own 3 or 4% of profitability was quite difficult because of the power that these Canadian retailers or American retailers with Canadian activities had over your business. They would literally say to you, we want this, this, and this, and we'll pay you this, and take it or leave it. Conversely, look at the US business where, there's consolidation has started there as well, but still much more diversity. There's no national grocer in the US, although Walmart and Costco are across the US and are very powerful. But you also have many regional chains, many specialty chains, and you're able to quite often find more margin there. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also play the dollar. And so you end up getting, sometimes up to 15 points on selling there. So I would say that food manufacturers in Canada, once they get to a certain size, say $100 million revenue, 300 to 400 employees working within their manufacturing company, it's so much simpler to just make product in Canada using that hedge of the dollar and to sell it into the US. So in my personal opinion, as somebody who's worked on as an executive within food manufacturing companies, that's where there's a huge problem. And that's why we have shrinkflation and why you see packaging sizes going down, because that's the only way you can go back to your customer. As a food company, you have to go through two hurdles. You have to sell into the retailer, then you have to sell to the consumer. If you can't sell to the retailer, the consumer doesn't even matter to you anymore. So if the retailer says to you, we'll only give you this much money, then you have to say, okay, well, I could take a chicken finger out of that freezer pack, or I could make my my package size a little bit lighter weight if you're selling cereal or something of that nature. So there's a power dynamic in Canada that I would say is not encouraging innovation and growth of Canadian companies, and is actually encouraging them in some cases to pick up and move to the US.
Just to jump in real quickly, I couldn't have said it better myself, Dana. And this is actually something I'm actually going to be doing an op-ed in the Tour Star in the next little bit on. As my practice is unique in that I actually am one of a handful of people in North America that are cross-border licensed, and that I'm licensed to practice in Canada and the United States. And so that gives me a unique lens to seeing firsthand behavioral differences in Canadians and Americans. And you basically just summarized one of the things I've been taught. Canada has a love affair with oligopolies. We have 3 major retailers for groceries. We have 6 banks. We have 4 major telco companies. Canada does not foster an environment for competition. And I think a lot of it is down to our antitrust laws not being strong enough. I think there should be size limits on entities, and they should be broken up. The fact that Rogers and Shaw just merged, for example, that's another major thing. So we encourage that behavior rather than discourage the behavior. And this is a political thing. And I don't get into politics. I'm more of a realist because I'm a capitalist, but it is what it is, whether I like it or not. But the point is these things exist, and Canada does not support entrepreneurialism the way that our American folks do. And I actually see this in decision-making in Canadians. And I'll give you, again, a little bit of an anecdotal example. But whenever I'm speaking with a Canadian family about doing anything, it doesn't matter what it is. If they're looking at a deal of any sort, they'll do their due diligence, they'll make a decision, and then they'll go to a committee and then decide between their friends and family, whoever, and it might take 6 months. It's a very European style of decision-making. Versus my American counterparts, they'll look at it, they'll do their due diligence, and then they'll make a very quick decision, yes or no, and then move on. And I think it's a behavioral difference in society as well. And they're quicker to make decisions. They have typically less red tape politically than we do up here. And then as a result, they're able to do things faster. And that's part of the reason why they have a very innovative nature in their people. And in Canada, we don't foster risk taking. And I think that's part of it. So if you guys see an op-ed from me in the next little bit, that's basically what it is. It'll be a little bit of a rant, but absolutely, I think you hit the nail on the head, Dana.
Yeah, guys, thanks. It's a great discussion. And part of this is to kind of land on a challenge, like I said at the top. So maybe this is one of the areas that we could try to change as part of this program. I want to give Jenna a bit of stage time, because Jenna, your audio isn't great. I don't know, we tested Jenna before, but for some reason it's breaking up. But let's just, because Jenna has some really interesting work that she's done on restrictive covenants that's related to the discussion we're having. So Jenna, I don't know, I'll pass it over to you, and if you want to share your presentation and get into that topic, because I feel that that's super interesting, something I was not aware of before I spoke to you.
To first explain what a restrictive covenant is, in its simplest version or terms, it can be described as a contract of sorts between two pieces of property. And so one property has to benefit from the covenant while the other is burdened. And then if certain conditions are met, then the restrictive covenant runs with the land, which means that it continues to apply even if either or both of the properties are sold. So once a restrictive covenant has been entered into and it's registered on title, it basically remains on title until it expires if it has an expiry date, or it just runs in perpetuity because it does not have an expiry date, even as there's new owners of that piece of property. Why do we have these? Is they were basically a historical means of controlling neighborhood development between neighbors before we had municipal land use and planning powers like we do today. And so basically you'd have a group of neighbors get together and they would agree on things like what color can their houses be, or doors, or what materials can be used for fencing, or they would agree about what people could generally use their properties for, and they would enter into these agreements and then register them on title. And so a grocery store covenant is specifically a restrictive covenant that has been put in place by a grocery store in order to restrict the placement of grocery stores, food supermarkets, convenience stores, other food retailers, and pharmacies. And so I did a master's thesis on this where I actually mapped where some of these covenants were in Halifax, Nova Scotia, being that that's where I'm from. And so unfortunately, the way our land title system works, there's no easy way to just go and see where these covenants are. So the way I had to do it is I went through 30 years of old phone books at the public library and made a list of where all of the grocery stores historically were within HRM, and then took that list of addresses and had to individually look up every address in the title system to see if a covenant came up or not. I ended up locating 44 of them, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but given how big Halifax is, it's actually quite a bit. And the location of some of these covenants was quite notable. For example, we have the Gottingen Street area in Halifax, which is the North End. It's part of a historic Black neighborhood, and they haven't had a grocery store in their community in nearly over 30 years. And I found a bunch of these covenants in the area, in that neighborhood, that basically were on almost all of the commercial property available in that neighborhood. And though I think it needs more research to determine if that is exactly why they don't have a grocery store, I think anyone looking at that can have a bit of a gut feeling and a common sense response to that, which is that it has to be connected somehow. And so the Competition Bureau recently put out a report just at the end of June this year, and one of their recommendations was that the different levels of government need to deal with these covenants in some fashion, because this is anti-competitive behavior and it's restricting restricting, but also maintaining the control that the current big grocery store chains have on the grocery market in Canada, because not only is it really hard to enter the market in Canada generally, but then you're also putting a restriction on where you can open. And so you might have a property that's really suitable for a grocery store because maybe once upon a time it was a grocery store, but a grocery business can't open up in there. As like a personal example, which is what spurred my interest in this topic, is that the closest grocery store to the community where I grew up closed probably 16 years ago, and it's been a vacant building ever since. And I actually did find a restrictive covenant registered on title on that property, and it also restricts a doctor's office from opening up in that space. And I have a lot of questions about why that's included that I probably never have answers for, but it's an interesting issue. In Ontario, we don't really know where they are because I was lucky in Nova Scotia. They gave me like a researcher's license where I could pay so much money for a day of time and do as many searches as I want. But in Ontario, it's $30-$40 a search. So it's going to be really expensive really quickly to do these searches to try to map where they are. So unfortunately, we know that this is a practice and we know that this is going on, and the Competition Bureau has made some comments and some recommendations in their report to try to encourage the provincial governments, for example, to try to address this issue. But given how vague of an issue it seems and the fact that it involves private businesses, I'm not sure how much political will there is for provinces to actually deal with this as an issue.
You know, you mentioned the phone books and the research piece, right? Like, besides systematic change, what do you think would be a good challenge, like a good project for like young people to take on using technology to kind of disrupt or democratize this process?
Yeah, so there's actually some really interesting covenant mapping projects that have been done in the States, and I don't know if it'd be possible to replicate them in any way. So I can give an example. Um, and restricted covenants were also used in this way in Canada, but I think maybe just not as widespread. So in the States, people would actually put restrictive covenants on neighborhoods to say no Black people can live here, no Jews can live here. And so there were actually racial restrictive covenants used to restrict where certain minority groups and people of color could live. And so while technically these covenants are now like broadly banned, broadly illegal, you can't use restrictive covenants for racial reasons like this anymore, there's some universities in the States that have done some really cool mapping projects to show where these covenants existed and to show how that's influenced or affected community growth over the years and the location of things. And I've never seen a project like that in Canada. So I don't know why that would be, but that might be something like a cool thing that you could use tech for, is to do some sort of mapping project.
Gotcha. Amazing. Thanks, Jenna, for bringing this topic to light. I think I think awareness is the first step here. Like I said, I wasn't aware. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience were not aware. So thanks for doing the research and taking the time to dig into this. So very, very interesting. And just following up on that, I think you'd also mentioned food trucks or farmers markets can't being opened in certain areas. I don't know if you just want to quickly give some points on that discussion.
I'll turn off my video again and hope that it helps.
Yeah, it's a lot better.
So with zoning generally, municipalities have the power to decide where certain types of things are going to go. And the issue is that grocery stores like Sobeys and Loblaws are then placing even further restrictions on where these types of businesses can go. But unfortunately, you're stuck having to also comply with those. And so, I think we're seeing a lot of municipalities open up and make changes to permit things like urban agriculture, which I think has its own set of issues with depending on where people are doing that and if it's suitable and if there's any sort of contaminants. But I think the issue with this practice of using restrictive covenants is that you're placing further restrictions upon the zoning that exists that's supposed to direct where these things go.
Gotcha.
That answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. So we have a few minutes left here, so I'm just going to jump into some Q&A questions that we have. Just try to answer a few of these, and this is open to anyone. First question is, what are ways that can post-secondary institutions help develop a sustainable food supply? This is by Lori. So what are new ways that post-secondary institutions can help develop sustainable food supplies?
I'll hop in, having worked at a post-secondary institution myself in the not too distant past. So I think initiatives like the Arrow Food Institute at the University of Guelph are very interesting because they introduce very high level topics similar to this webinar, and they introduce them amongst I guess, the only way to put it really is a fairly rarefied audience, but people who really do have the intellectual and sometimes financial power to make big things happen. So I do think that type of activity within post-secondary institutions is very it's, to use a farming analogy, it plants seeds that grow into things. It takes a long time. I also think that Canada has some really awesome government-sponsored, grants and activities, things like SEFREF and NSERC, which please don't ask me to break down the acronyms. I can probably only get half of them, which give academics who have curiosity and knowledge and amazing research skills and opportunity to dig into the topics that we're talking about and give people like those of us on this webinar the facts and the background and the data to be able to form some of the opinions that we've shared today. So I am I subscribe to many different feeds and social media accounts of people working in post-secondary institutions here in Canada to get that kind of information. At the next tier down, the college level, the supports for entrepreneurs who want to develop food products that are safe and well made and that can be have extended shelf life and access new technologies like the kind that the Canadian Food Innovation Network under my direction helps to develop is tremendous. And in fact, on our Yodel platform, we have a weekly, it's called the 50, because we publish it 50 times a year, so every week except Canada Day and the Christmas break, where we feature another Canadian amazing resource, and many of them happen to be rested within academic institutions, and we have years worth of content ahead of us. So we've got great resources that generally speaking have direct or indirect government and philanthropic type of funding that do make our food innovation landscape richer and more actionable.
Thanks,
If I can
Dana.
just jump in real quick, I know that we're getting really short on time here, Ravi, but I'll say this really fast. I think harboring more incubators is probably one of the best things that Canada can do. If you look at the success that Ryerson's DMZ has had, Mars at U of T, they're all very tech focused. I think partially because tech is sexy. I think if we start making food sexy again, historically Canada has been known as an agricultural society and natural resource society. We've been trying to get away from that for years, but that's one of our strengths. Why are we not coming back to that? So I think that would be one if we actually had some either leadership at some of the education institutions or even just entrepreneurs. And I look at my friend Abdullah who runs the DMZ at Ryerson. That was one of the things that him and the previous Chancellor Sheldon they created. And it just takes one person to have an idea and then run with it, and then ideally have some people who can move hurdles out of your way. So I think it just takes some people with some innovation and to take a risk.
Yeah, no, thanks, Shiraz. Well, I'm inspired by Glenn. He's making food cool again for sure. Guys, we're at time, and there's one question here, Glenn, maybe that you could just answer real fast. Someone was asking about hydroponic farming and the status of that. I don't know if you've any info on that to add.
I mean, I'm not an expert on it by any means. It's got its own challenges in Canada, especially, for example, heating, and also being competitive with products that are coming in from outside of the country. But there's a lot of investment, certainly from what I can see, in terms of going into building those containers and the indoor growing and all that type of stuff. So yeah, that's about as much as I can say on it.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. I think we're going to wrap up here. In listening to the conversation, I just remembered a story that my grandfather told me, which kind of combines everything. So I moved from Guyana when I was 12. That's where we lived. And my grandfather was trying to escape on a boat to go to Trinidad. And from Trinidad, he would then make his way to the US or something like that. But this boat transported bananas. So he and a friend painted themselves green and got on the boat with the bananas trying to escape. And then the bananas all turned yellow, but they were the only green patch in the entire boat. So he was caught and sent back. And this is a true story. Supply chains and food innovation all tied in there. But anyways, guys, thank you so much. We're going to obviously talk about this a lot longer. Really appreciate your time today. Jenna, Shiraz, Glenn, and Dana. Very, very insightful conversations. Thanks to our audience. Appreciate you joining us. And I'd like to thank our sponsors again, and Jenny Law and Sana Ali, our production and marketing teams. Next steps, guys, we will sort of digest the information we had today and put out some challenge proposals and get to step 2, 3, and 4 in the Industry Future Challenge project. So thanks again, guys. Really appreciated it. Had a lot of fun, and I will talk to you all very soon. Take care.